My apologies, I wasn't aware the staff's family was part of the evening's entertainment. Perhaps you could practice your craft somewhere less visible. The voice, dripping with honeyed condescension, belonged to Aveline Dubois. It sliced through the opulent murmur of the Grandatoria ballroom, sharp enough to make Lyndon Mitchell flinch. He froze, his dark brown hands tightening on the handle of his mop, the world shrinking to the puddle of spilled champagne at his feet and the searing gaze of the woman who owned the room. A black single dad in his 30s in a gray janitor's uniform, he had become a ghost on these polished floors, a necessary but unseen cog in the machinery of her perfect evening. Until now. His 5-year-old daughter, Luna, had been tucked away in a shadowed alcove behind a marble pillar, a silent observer in a world of silk and diamonds. At Aveline's cruel remark, she shrank back, her small shoulders curling inward as if to disappear completely. Her warm brown face, usually so bright and open, was now flushed with a shame she was too young to understand, but felt with the piercing clarity of childhood. Lyndon's heart fractured. He kept his own eyes down, focused on the swirling patterns the mop made on the floor. He had learned years ago that invisibility was a shield. Look down. Be quiet. And the world leaves you alone, especially when you're a black man in a room that was never built for you. But that shield didn't protect Luna. Aveline didn't wait for a response. She swept past, a queen dismissing a peasant, her custom-made gown of midnight silk whispering over the floor he had just polished. Her entourage, a small cluster of sycophants, mirrored her disdain with faint, knowing smiles. Across the room, Julian Blackwood watched the entire exchange, a smirk playing on his lips. As the artistic director of the Dubois Foundation, he was the architect of this grand affair. But his true masterpiece was the subtle cultivation of chaos. He knew exactly who Lyndon Mitchell was, and the sight of the world-renowned virtuoso, a man who once held thousands breathless with a single chord, now cleaning up spilled drinks, was a symphony of vengeance sweeter than any music. Julian glided over to Aveline, his movements smooth and practiced. "Excellent work, Aveline," he murmured, his voice a low purr of insincere admiration. "One must maintain standards. The line between charity and a public shelter can be so terribly thin." Aveline gave a satisfied nod, her gaze already scanning the crowd for the arrival of the mayor. Distractions are unacceptable. Tonight is about raising $2 million for the academy, not hosting a bring your daughter to work day. The irony was lost on her. The entire evening, a spectacle of calculated opulence, was in the name of providing underprivileged children with a chance to study music, children just like the one she had dismissed moments before. Lyndon finished his task, the champagne gone, the floor gleaming. He pushed his cart toward the service corridor, his movements economical and silent. He retrieved Luna from her hiding spot, her small hand immediately finding his. It was trembling. "Is that lady mad at us, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and fragile. Lyndon knelt, ignoring the pristine crease in his uniform trousers. He looked into her wide, dark eyes, a mirror of his late wife's. "No, sweet pea. She's not mad. Some people are just loud on the inside. It has nothing to do with you." He smoothed a stray coil of hair from her forehead, fingers brushing the tight curls she'd inherited from him. "You are the most important person in this whole building. Don't you ever forget that." She leaned against him, her trust absolute. In her world, her father wasn't a janitor. He was the man who could fix any broken toy, tell the best bedtime stories, and make a fortress out of pillows and blankets. He was everything. He settled her back in the alcove with her sketchbook and a juice box, promising to be back soon. Her drawings were her own form of music now, intricate worlds filled with fantastical creatures and soaring castles, a silent symphony he was terrified he would one day be unable to protect. The main event of the evening was a performance by Maestro Valerius, a living legend, a pianist whose fingers had danced across the keys for over 60 years. His presence alone had guaranteed a sold-out gala, and the anticipation in the ballroom was a palpable energy. As Lyndon continued his rounds, he saw the maestro being escorted toward the backstage area. The old man moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane, but his eyes still held a fiery spark of artistic passion. He paused as he passed Lyndon, his gaze lingering for a moment on Lyndon's hands. Lyndon instinctively curled his fingers, hiding the calluses and the faint silvery scar that snaked across his left knuckle. The maestro simply nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before continuing on. 10 minutes before the performance was set to begin, Lyndon was emptying a trash receptacle in the corridor just outside the maestro's private dressing room. The door was slightly ajar. He could hear the low murmur of voices, Julian's slick tones attempting to soothe, followed by a wheezing cough. Then came a sudden sharp gasp and the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Shouts erupted from within the room. "Get a medic! Somebody call 911! Lyndon's training, the muscle memory from a life before this one, kicked in. He pushed his cart aside and stepped toward the open door just as a frantic stagehand burst out. "He's collapsed! The maestro collapsed!" Julian Blackwood emerged next, his face a mask of theatrical panic, but his eyes, when they met Lyndon's for a fleeting second, held a glint of triumphant delight. This was not a setback for Julian, it was an opportunity. Aveline Dubois was summoned, her imperial calm finally fracturing as she pushed her way into the room. Lyndon saw her face go pale, the carefully constructed composure shattering like a dropped vase. "What do you mean he can't perform?" Her voice was a high-pitched shriek, all pretense of control gone. "The entire gala depends on him. My reputation depends on him." Paramedics arrived, a flurry of professional urgency confirming the worst. Maestro Valerius had suffered a massive stroke. He was alive, but he wouldn't be playing tonight, or perhaps ever again. The news spread backstage like a virus, infecting the crew with a paralyzing sense of dread. The $2 million fundraiser, the pinnacle of Aveline's career, was about to become a very public, very humiliating disaster. The conductor of the orchestra, a portly man named Gerald Finn, wrung his hands, his face ashen. "What do we do, Miss Dubois?" "The guests are waiting. We can't just cancel." Aveline stared at him, her mind racing, but for the first time in her life, she had no answer. Every contingency plan, every strategy was useless. Julian stepped beside her, placing a hand on her arm in a gesture of false support. "A terrible tragedy," he said, his voice laced with mock sympathy. "There is simply nothing to be done." But Gerald, a man who had dedicated his life to music, refused to accept defeat. His gaze darted around the panicked faces backstage, searching for an impossible solution. His eyes landed on the empty piano bench on the stage, a silent, mocking monument to their failure. The weight of the impending catastrophe settled on his shoulders, and in a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation, he knew what he had to do. He turned away from Aveline and Julian and began walking toward the stage, his steps heavy with the fate of the entire evening. Gerald Finn stepped through the velvet curtain, the heat of 1,000 spotlights hitting him like a physical force. He walked to the center of the stage, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. A hush fell over the ballroom as 2,000 pairs of eyes focused on him, the expectant silence thick with anticipation. From the wings, Aveline watched, her hands clenched into fists, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down her temple. This was the moment her perfect world either held together or shattered into a million pieces. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gerald began, his voice amplified by the microphone, trembling just enough to betray the crisis unfolding behind the scenes. I have some difficult news." A nervous murmur rippled through the audience. "Maestro Valerius has suffered a sudden medical emergency. He is in stable condition and is being attended to, but he will be unable to perform for us tonight." Gasps of shock and concern filled the room. Whispers of, "Is he all right?" And what a tragedy spread from table to table. Aveline closed her eyes. This was it, the public admission of failure. Her gala, the talk of the town for months, was a fiasco. Backstage, her composure finally crumbled. She turned to Julian, her voice a furious whisper. "This is your fault. You were in charge of his schedule, his health, everything. "My dear Aveline," Julian replied, his calm an infuriating counterpoint to her panic. "I am an artistic director, not a cardiologist. Even I cannot predict an act of God. It's a shame, but what can one do?" His feigned helplessness was more insulting than any direct taunt. He was enjoying this. On stage, Gerald swallowed hard, seeing the disappointment on the faces of the donors. He saw the empty piano, a black void where the evening's magic was supposed to happen, and in a moment of reckless desperation, he decided to set one last impossible fire, hoping for a miracle. He leaned into the microphone again, his voice cracking with emotion. "The Dubois Foundation has worked all year to bring this evening together, to build a future for children who dream of music." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The maestro would not want that dream to fail tonight. He took a deep breath. "So I am asking, in a complete break from protocol, a desperate plea. Is there anyone here tonight, anyone at all who can play Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto?" The question hung in the air, followed by a profound, deafening silence. It was an absurd request, an insane gamble. It was like asking if a passenger could fly a jumbo jet. Rachmaninoff's Third was a beast, a Mount Everest of the piano repertoire, demanding not just technical mastery, but a lifetime of emotional depth. The silence stretched, then broke into a flurry of awkward coughs and disbelieving murmurs. The guests looked at each other, some shaking their heads in pity for the conductor's obvious breakdown. Lyndon heard the plea from a monitor in the service corridor. The words Rachmaninoff's Third struck him not as a sound, but as a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs, his vision swam. That piece, it was the last thing he had ever played in public, the encore. The final triumphant cascade of notes before the stage light, loosened from its rigging, had fallen. Before the screaming, the blood, the agonizing pain in his hand, the frantic rush to the hospital. The last piece of music his wife Clara ever heard him play. His hand flew to the scar on his knuckle, a phantom ache radiating up his arm. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to grab Luna, to get his cart, and to disappear into the anonymity of the city. This wasn't his world anymore. He had given it up, buried it under 6 feet of grief and a mountain of responsibility. He turned to look at Luna. She had heard the conductor's plea through the open doorway. She was looking at the monitor, then up at him. There was no pressure in her eyes, no expectation, just a simple, profound faith. She didn't know the concerto's name or the dark story attached to it. She only knew that a man on the stage was sad and needed help, and that her daddy could make beautiful sounds come from a piano. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice cutting through the roaring in his ears. "That man is scared. Can you help him?" Her question reframed everything. It wasn't about his pain, his past, or his fear. It wasn't about Julian's smirk or Aveline's scorn. It was about a simple request from his daughter. "Can you help him?" He looked at her trusting face, the last most precious piece of Clara he had left in the world. For years he had defined his love for her by what he hid from, the spotlight, the music, the memories. But what if love was also defined by what you were willing to face? He saw Julian's smug face in his mind's eye, a man who had built a career on the ruins of Lyndon's own. He saw Aveline's cold dismissal. He thought of the children who would lose their chance at music if this night failed. He made a choice. Slowly, deliberately, he let go of his cart. The squeak of its wheels had been the soundtrack to his life for 5 years. Now he walked away from it. He moved out of the service corridor and into the controlled chaos of the backstage area. Stagehands and ushers, busy whispering about the disaster, turned to see him. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" a burly stage manager started to say, putting a hand out. "Staff stays clear." Lyndon didn't stop. He met the man's eyes, and for the first time in years, the timid janitor was gone. In his place was the ghost of the maestro, a black man of purpose and unbreakable will. The stage manager's hand dropped. The whispers died around him as he walked toward the stage, a silent, determined figure in a plain gray uniform. On stage, Gerald was about to apologize, to admit defeat, when a movement in the wings caught his eye. Aveline saw it too. her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is that janitor doing?" "Somebody stop him," she hissed. Julian's smirk froze on his face. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a dawning, sickening horror as he recognized the walk, the posture, the sheer undeniable presence of the man he thought he had erased from the world. Lyndon Mitchell stepped out from the shadows of the curtain and into the brilliant glare of the stage lights. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as 2,000 people turned their attention from the conductor to the janitor, still in his uniform, with the faint scent of cleaning fluid clinging to him. He took his first step toward the gleaming black concert grand, his scarred hand slowly uncurling from a fist. A wave of confused murmurs washed over the ballroom. People leaned toward each other, whispering behind cupped hands. "Is this a joke?" a woman in diamonds asked her husband. "Perhaps it's some sort of avant-garde performance art," he replied, a dismissive sneer on his face. From the cheap seats in the back to the VIP tables at the front, the sentiment was the same, a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. In the wings, Aveline Dubois's face was a mask of incandescent fury. This was not just a failure, it was a circus. Her $2 million black tie gala was being commandeered by her janitor. "Security!" she snarled into her phone. "Get me security to the main stage now. There is a staff member who is having some sort of episode. Have him removed quietly if possible, but just get him out of my sight." Julian Blackwood recovered from his initial shock, his mind working quickly. The ghost had returned from the grave, and he had to be exorcised before he could speak. Julian strode onto the stage, his movements oozing false authority, positioning himself between Lyndon and the piano. He took the microphone from a stunned Gerald Finn. "Ladies and gentlemen, my sincerest apologies for this interruption," Julian announced, his voice smooth as silk. "It seems one of our more enthusiastic staff members has gotten a little confused." He turned to Lyndon, his smile a predatory slash. "Sir, thank you for your commitment to your job, but the stage is for the performers. The spills are in the lobby." The crowd tittered, the tension momentarily breaking into cruel laughter. Lyndon's gaze remained fixed not on his tormentor, but on the conductor. He ignored Julian as if he were a buzzing fly, his focus absolute. He took another step forward. "You asked for a pianist," Lyndon said. His voice was quiet, unused to projecting across a vast space, but it carried an undeniable weight that cut through the lingering laughter. Gerald Finn stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He saw past the ill-fitting gray uniform to the eyes. They were the eyes of an artist, haunted, deep, but burning with a fire he hadn't seen since he was a young student in the presence of the old masters. He was ruined either way. The Gala was dead. What was one more absurdity in a night full of them? "The concerto," Gerald said, his voice a low, urgent query only Lyndon could hear. "The Ossia Cadenza. Can you play it?" It was a test. The Ossia Cadenza of Rachmaninoff's Third is a legend among pianists, an alternative passage of such ferocious difficulty that even many professional soloists opt for the simpler standard version. It was a question designed to expose a fraud in an instant. A flicker of a memory, fingers flying, and a triumphant roar from the crowd crossed Lyndon's face. He met the conductor's gaze and gave a simple, solemn nod. "It's the only way it should be played." The answer struck Gerald like a lightning bolt. It was the exact phrase Maestro Valerius himself had used in their rehearsal yesterday. The sheer, unshakable confidence in those words was impossible to fake. Before Gerald could respond, 2 burly security guards in black suits arrived at the edge of the stage, their eyes locked on Lyndon, waiting for the signal from Aveline. "There he is," she commanded from the wings. "Get him!" But as the guards took their first step onto the stage, a small figure darted out from behind the velvet curtain. "Daddy!" It was Luna. Her little face had gone tight with fear, her knuckles white as she clutched her sketchbook to her chest. A tiny black girl in a simple dress, she ran across the vast stage, a determined figure, and threw her arms around Lyndon's legs as if to protect him from the approaching giants. The sight of the small child clinging to the janitor sent a new shockwave through the audience. The last of the snickering died instantly. The narrative shifted from a staff member having a breakdown to a father being publicly humiliated in front of his daughter. The mood soured, the sympathy in the room swinging violently away from the organizers and toward the man in the gray uniform. Lyndon gently placed a hand on Luna's head, stroking her curls. "It's okay, sweet pea," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "Everything is okay. These men are just here to help." He looked at the security guards who had stopped in their tracks, suddenly unsure of their role in this strange, unfolding drama. He guided Luna gently toward a trusted-looking stagehand at the side, a woman who had given him a kind smile earlier in the day. "Can you watch her for me? Just for a few minutes." The woman nodded, her eyes full of a new respect, and took Luna's hand. Lyndon turned back to Gerald, his resolve hardened into steel. "Let me play." It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a demand born of 5 years of silence. Julian stood speechless, his plan to discredit Lyndon undone by the one person he had never factored into his equations, a little girl. Gerald Finn made his choice. He raised a hand, waving off the security guards with a sharp, dismissive gesture. He turned to the orchestra, whose members had been watching the drama with a mixture of bewilderment and intrigue. He tapped his baton for attention, the sound sharp and definitive. "Maestro," he said, his voice ringing with a sudden wild hope as he addressed Lyndon with the honorific, "To your position." A ripple of disbelief went through the musicians, but they were professionals. They raised their instruments, the rustle of sheet music filling the silence. Lyndon Mitchell, the janitor, the ghost of the grand history, walked the final 10 feet to the 9-foot Steinway concert grand. He stood before it for a long moment, the polished black surface reflecting his worn uniform and the haunted look in his eyes, his deep brown skin and close-cropped curls warped in the glossy lid. The audience held its breath, a collective silent entity. He looked down at the 88 keys, a battlefield where he had lost everything. He flexed his left hand once, the silvery scar across his knuckle catching the light. The weight of his past, the hope for his future, and the love for his daughter all hung suspended in that single heart-stopping moment of silence before his fingers touched the ivory. The silence in the ballroom stretched for 1 second, then 2. It was a silence so complete that the clink of a single ice cube in a glass from the back of the room sounded like a crack of thunder. Lyndon's fingers hovered over the keys, his shoulders set, his breath held. Then they fell. There was no tentative first note, no gentle introduction. The opening was a cataclysm of sound, a thunderous cascade of chords that erupted from the piano with the force of a tidal wave. It was the sound of 5 years of grief, anger, and suffocating silence being unleashed in a single explosive moment. The sheer power of it slammed into the audience, a physical shock that straightened spines and sent jaws slack. All skepticism, all pity, all mockery was vaporized in an instant. The orchestra, caught off guard by the raw ferocity of the entrance, nearly missed their cue. They scrambled to join in, their professional instincts taking over, but they were no longer leading. They were following. The janitor, a black man none of them had ever truly seen, was commanding the stage with an authority that bordered on tyrannical. He did not play with the music. He wrestled with it, bent it to his will, his body swaying with a rhythm that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. Gerald Finn, the conductor, felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. His baton, which had felt so heavy moments before, was now impossibly light. He was no longer trying to salvage a disaster. He was trying to keep up with a miracle. He locked eyes with Lyndon, and a silent, electrifying dialogue began between them. A dance of tempo and dynamics, of passion and precision. This wasn't just a performance, it was a resurrection. From the wings, Julian Blackwood watched, his face a bloodless mask of disbelief. This was impossible. The man he had broken, the man whose career he had meticulously dismantled, was not just playing. He was soaring. Julian's eyes narrowed, focusing on Lyndon's left hand, the one with the scar. He waited for it to falter, to seize up on the lightning-fast runs, to betray the nerve damage he knew was there. But the hand did not fail. It moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, the scar a pale streak against the blur of motion. The hand was not weaker for its wound. It seemed to have been forged in it, tempered by pain into something unbreakable. Aveline Dubois stood frozen, her phone still clutched in her hand, the order to remove Linden forgotten. The music bypassed her carefully constructed walls of logic and ambition and struck something deep and dormant within her. It was a raw, unfiltered emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She, who measured the world in profit margins and strategic acquisitions, was being confronted by something unquantifiable, something of sublime and terrifying beauty. She saw the sweat beading on Linden's brow, the corded muscles in his forearms, the absolute focus in his eyes. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He was a force of nature, and against her will, she was completely and utterly captivated. The first movement was a tempest, a story of struggle and defiance. Then the music softened, transitioning into the haunting, melancholic beauty of the intermezzo. Here, Linden's playing changed. The ferocious power receded, replaced by a tenderness so profound it felt like an intrusion to witness. He closed his eyes, and the ballroom, the audience, the orchestra, they all disappeared. He was playing for an audience of one. He was playing for Clara. Each note was a memory, her laughter in their small apartment, the warmth of her hand in his, the devastating finality of her last breath. He was painting her portrait in sound, and the grief was so pure, so beautiful that people in the audience began to weep without knowing why. Then came the ossia cadenza, the moment of truth. Linden's eyes snapped open, the fire returning. The orchestra fell silent as he launched into the legendary passage alone. It was an explosion of notes, a storm of controlled chaos. His hands were no longer two separate entities, but a single 10-fingered blur flying across the keyboard with a speed and precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. This was not just music, it was a fight. He was battling the ghost of Julian Blackwood. He was wrestling with the trauma of the accident. He was confronting the pain that had kept him silent for half a decade. Every chord was a blow against his past. Every arpeggio a cry of freedom. In the wings, Luna watched, her face pressed against the curtain. She wasn't awed or surprised. To her, this was not a miracle. This was simply her daddy. This was the music she heard in the lullabies he hummed, the sad, quiet melodies he would tap out on the kitchen table late at night when he thought she was asleep. This was the music that lived inside him, and for the first time, everyone else was getting to hear it too. She smiled, a simple, radiant smile of pure love and pride. The cadenza reached its thundering climax, and the orchestra surged back in, rejoining the fray. The music swelled, building toward the final breathtaking movement. The energy in the room was electric, a shared collective trance. Conductor, soloist, orchestra, and audience were all bound together, hurtling towards the same explosive conclusion. Linden was no longer just playing the music. He was the music, he was the storm, the sorrow, and the soaring, defiant triumph, a man being reborn in a baptism of sound, his fingers flying toward the final chords that would not just end the performance, but begin his life anew. The final movement was a breathtaking ascent, a climb from the depths of sorrow to a summit of pure, unadulterated triumph. The piano and orchestra were no longer separate entities, but a single glorious voice roaring toward the heavens. Linden was a blur of motion, his body a conduit for the torrent of music pouring through him. The final chords arrived like a series of controlled explosions, each one more powerful than the last, shaking the very foundation of the ballroom. The last note, a triumphant, resonant C major chord, hung in the air for a long, perfect moment, shimmering like a newly formed star, and then silence. Then, it was a different silence this time, not of confusion or pity, but of profound, reverent awe. For 3 long seconds, 2,000 people were held in a state of suspended animation, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The spell was broken by a single choked sob from the balcony, immediately followed by one man leaping to his feet and shouting a single word. "Bravo!" It was as if he had opened a floodgate. The ballroom erupted. It wasn't applause, it was a physical roar, a tsunami of sound that washed over the stage. Every single person was on their feet, clapping, cheering, whistling. Men in $1,000 tuxedos were shouting themselves hoarse. Women in designer gowns had tears streaming down their faces, their mascara forgotten. They were no longer the jaded elite of the city. They were simply people who had been touched by something divine. On stage, the roar of the crowd was a disorienting wave that threatened to pull Lyndon under. The adrenaline began to fade, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion set in. The world swam back into focus. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling violently. A sharp, familiar pain shot up his arm from the scar on his knuckle, a cruel reminder of the price of his art. He looked out at the sea of cheering faces, but he didn't see them. His eyes scanned the wings, searching for the only validation he needed. Gerald Finn was the first to reach him. Tears were streaming down the conductor's face as he grabbed at Lyndon's right hand and held it aloft like a champion's trophy. "A miracle," he bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion. "You've saved us. Magnificent." The musicians of the orchestra were on their feet, not just clapping but tapping their bows against their music stands in the ultimate sign of respect. The first chair violinist, a woman known for her icy professionalism, simply shook her head back and forth, muttering "impossible" to herself. Lyndon gently pulled his hand from Gerald's grasp. The adulation felt foreign, a language he no longer spoke. He gave a single stiff bow to the audience, a reflex from a forgotten life, and then turned his back on the thunderous ovation. His only thought was escape. As he stumbled towards the wings, he saw Julian Blackwood. For a moment, their eyes met across the chaos. There was no smirk on Julian's face now. There was only a cold, reptilian fury and a flicker of something else, fear. Without a word, Julian turned and melted into the shadows of the backstage labyrinth, a coward fleeing the ghost he could not defeat. Lyndon stepped off that stage, and the first person to meet him was Luna. She threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in his cheap uniform. "You were so loud, Daddy," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. He sank to his knees, ignoring the pain, and hugged her back with all his remaining strength. "Was I too loud?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, her deep brown eyes shining. "No," she said. "It was the best kind of loud." That was the only review that mattered. That was his standing ovation. "Mr. Mitchell." The voice was cool and controlled, but it held a new, uncertain timbre. Lyndon looked up to see Aveline Dubois standing before them, her personal assistant hovering at her elbow. The imperious queen was gone. In her place was a woman who looked profoundly shaken, as if the very ground beneath her feet had shifted. "That was," she began, then stopped, searching for a word that her business-oriented vocabulary could not provide. "Unexpected," she finished lamely. "Your performance was exceptional. I clearly misjudged the situation." It was the closest thing to an apology Aveline Dubois had likely ever offered. It was clumsy, impersonal, and entirely inadequate, but it was a start. Lyndon, however, was in no state to appreciate it. He was running on empty, his only priority the small, warm body clinging to him. He rose to his feet, pulling Luna close. "I need to take my daughter home," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "She's tired." He made to walk past her, a janitor dismissing the billionaire who owned the building. The role reversal was so stunning that Aveline was left speechless. For the first time, a man had looked at her and her entire world of power and influence and decided that none of it mattered. She stood frozen, watching him walk away. Her mind, already trying to calculate the PR angles, the media strategy, couldn't reconcile the artist who had just commanded the world with the Black father, who was now focused only on his child. As Lyndon and Luna reached the service corridor exit, a man with a press badge and wild, excited eyes rushed past them, making a beeline for Aveline. "Miss Dubois, an unbelievable night. A triumph from the jaws of disaster," the reporter gushed, his recorder already out. "The entire world will be talking about this. Everyone is asking the same question, and you're the only one who can answer it. Aveline finally tore her gaze away from Lyndon's retreating back and turned to the reporter, her CEO mask slipping back into place. "And what question is that? And what?" The reporter's voice buzzed with the energy of a career-defining scoop. "Where in God's name did you find him? And how did you convince him to return? No one has heard a note from the Maestro of Midnight in 5 years." The reporter's words hung in the air, electric and definitive. The Maestro of Midnight. The name struck Aveline with the force of a physical blow. Her mind, a supercomputer of data and connections, instantly began to process. Vague memories of articles read years ago, of headlines about a brilliant, reclusive young pianist who had taken the classical world by storm and then vanished without a trace. A prodigy who sold out Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall. A genius who was notoriously private, whose face was rarely photographed. Lyndon Mitchell, the name on her janitorial payroll file. It was impossible, it was unbelievable, and it was undeniably true. The humiliation was immediate and searing. The man she had mocked, the man she had ordered to be thrown out, was a cultural icon she should have been courting with million-dollar contracts. But the humiliation was quickly eclipsed by a more powerful instinct, opportunity. The disaster of her gala hadn't just been saved. It had been transformed into a global cultural event, and she was at the center of it. Meanwhile, Lyndon was trying to navigate the backstage labyrinth, which had become an impromptu receiving line. The news of his identity was spreading from person to person like a shockwave. Orchestra members who wouldn't have met his eye an hour ago now approached him with looks of reverence. "Maestro, your technique. I've never seen anything like it," the first chair violinist stammered. "Where have you been?" "The world has missed your voice," an elderly cellist said, his own voice thick with emotion. Lyndon just nodded, murmuring, "Excuse me," as he tried to shield Luna from the growing crowd. He felt the walls closing in, the precious anonymity he had cultivated for 5 years, shattering like glass. This was his nightmare, the fame, the attention, the questions. It was the life he had run from, and it was now cornering him in a service corridor. Just as the crowd threatened to become impassable, Aveline's voice cut through the noise. "Give them some space." She moved through the throng with renewed purpose, her regal authority fully restored, but this time it was wielded differently. She was not commanding them for her own sake. She was commanding them for his. She placed herself between Lyndon and the well-wishers, creating a protective barrier. "The man has just performed a miracle," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "He and his daughter need to go home. Please show some respect." The crowd fell back, surprised by her protective tone. It was a gesture of such unexpected decency that it stunned even Lyndon. Aveline met his eyes over the heads of the crowd, a complex mixture of apology, strategy, and genuine awe in her gaze. "My car is waiting at the service entrance," she said, her voice now low and directed only at him. "It will be faster. No reporters." Lyndon hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to be indebted to this woman. But he looked down at Luna, who was leaning against him, exhausted and overwhelmed by the noise and confusion. Aveline was right. It was the fastest way out. He gave a single, reluctant nod. The ride in the back of Aveline's Maybach was a cocoon of surreal silence. Outside, the city lights blurred past, a world away from the leather and polished wood of the limousine's interior. Luna, nestled against him, had fallen asleep almost instantly, her sketchbook clutched in her hand. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, the only sound the soft hum of the engine. Lyndon stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of his working-class neighborhood grow closer. The opulent car felt like an alien spacecraft navigating a foreign planet. "I had no idea," Aveline finally said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was stripped of its usual confidence. Lyndon did not look at her. That was the point. "Why?" she asked, the question direct and genuine. "Why would you give all that up to do what you do?" He thought of Clara, of the smell of antiseptic hospital corridors, of the terrifying fragility of his newborn daughter. He thought of the piano, how its beautiful sound had become tangled with the echo of a falling light rig and a scream. "The price got too high," he said, his voice flat. They pulled up in front of his apartment building, a modest 3-story brick structure that would have been invisible to Aveline on any other day of her life. The contrast was jarring. This was where the maestro of midnight lived, among nurses, mechanics, and teachers. The chauffeur opened the door, and the sounds of the city, a distant siren, music from an open window rushed in. Lyndon gently gathered the sleeping Luna into his arms. He stood ready to close the door on this bizarre chapter of his life, to retreat back into the safety of his anonymity. "Wait," Aveline said, her voice regaining a sliver of its old command. "Do not disappear again, Mitchell." He paused, his back to her. "What happened tonight was not an ending," she continued, her strategic mind clicking back into gear, now fused with a new, raw respect. "It was a beginning. The world will be looking for you. The foundation, we could offer you a position, artist in residence, a recording contract, anything. We can protect you, manage the story." Lyndon turned his head slightly, just enough to see her face in the dim interior light of the car. He looked at her, then down at the precious, peaceful weight of his daughter in his arms. He had played tonight for Luna, to show her that her father was not a man who hid, but he had not played to re-enter the world that had cost him everything. Without another word, he turned and gently closed the heavy car door, the soft click sealing her inside with her offers and her influence. He walked towards the entrance of his building, the sleeping child in his arms, the only treasure he had ever truly wanted. Aveline watched him go, the janitor who had walked away from a fortune twice. She sat alone in the cavernous back seat of her limousine, a queen in a rolling palace, suddenly aware that she had just lost a negotiation she did not even know how to begin. And for the first time in her life, she had absolutely no idea what to do next. The story of the Gala broke over the city like a tidal wave. By dawn, it was no longer a local high society event. It was a global phenomenon. Morning news shows led with grainy cell phone footage of a man in a janitor's uniform commanding a grand piano, the host's voices buzzing with hyperbole. Viral headlines dominated the internet. The Janitor Virtuoso, Lost Maestro returns in Gala miracle. From Mop Bucket to Mozart, the mystery of Lyndon Mitchell, and the one that made Lyndon's stomach clench. Who is the Maestro of Midnight, and where has he been? The world was ravenous for a story, and he was the main course. But inside apartment 2B of a nondescript brick building, the world was quiet. The only sound was the gentle sizzle of pancake batter hitting a hot pan and the scratching of a crayon on paper. Lyndon flipped a pancake, the motion practiced and domestic. He was back in his sanctuary, the quiet life he had so carefully constructed. The grand piano and the thunderous applause of the previous night felt like a strange, unsettling dream. On the wall near the tiny kitchen table hung a framed photo of Clara, Luna, and Lyndon. 3 smiling black faces in summer sunlight, frozen in a happiness he was still learning to live without. Luna sat at their small kitchen table, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she drew. She was sketching a picture of a man with a mop in one hand and a piano in the other, with musical notes floating around his head like a crown. There was no conflict in her drawing, no sense of dissonance. To her, her father was both things, and both were wonderful. "Is Miss Dubois going to be our friend now?" she asked, not looking up from her work. Lyndon placed a plate of pancakes in front of her. "I do not think so, Sweet Pea. We live in different worlds." "But she has a nice car," Luna stated, as if it were a simple, irrefutable fact. Before he could answer, the doorbell buzzed, a harsh, intrusive sound. Lyndon's shoulders tensed. He looked through the peephole to see a woman with a reporter's badge and a microphone, a cameraman hovering behind her. He did not open the door. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Sharon Hale with Channel 4 News. We would just love to have a word." Lyndon backed away from the door, his heart pounding. He put a finger to his lips, and Luna nodded, understanding. They waited in silence until the buzzing stopped and they heard the footsteps retreat down the hall. The siege had begun. Across town in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Julian Blackwood watched the same news report with a look of murderous fury. He hurled a crystal glass against the wall where it shattered, spraying whiskey across a framed photo of him accepting an award. He had spent 5 years enjoying the silence of Lyndon Mitchell's career. He had watched from the shadows as the world forgot the maestro of midnight. Now, in a single night, his nemesis had not only returned, but had become a global hero, a symbol of hidden genius and triumphant resurrection. It was intolerable. He picked up his phone, his mind already working, twisting the past into a new weapon. "Get me a line to Martin Davies at the Post," he snarled to his assistant. It is time the world heard the real story of Lyndon Mitchell's tragic final performance. In her own sterile, glass-walled office, Aveline Dubois was also watching the media storm. Her public relations team was celebrating, calling it the single greatest marketing coup in the Foundation's history. Donations were pouring in. The gala was a legendary success. But Aveline felt a strange sense of dissatisfaction. Her offer had been rejected. Her power had been nullified by a simple, silent closing of a car door. "Get me everything you can find on him," she told her assistant, her voice quiet and intense. "Not just his career. I want to know about his wife, Clara Mitchell. Find the police reports from the accident at his last concert. I want to know why he ran." Her motivation had shifted. This was no longer just about signing a star. It was about understanding the man who had humbled her. The intrusions continued. When Lyndon walked Luna to the elementary school at the end of the block, other parents stared, whispered, and pointed. A father who usually just gave him a passing nod now stopped him, gushing about the performance he'd seen on YouTube. Lyndon felt like an exhibit in a zoo. His quiet, invisible life was gone. The true conflict, however, arrived later that afternoon, dressed in a pink backpack and scuffed sneakers. Luna burst through that apartment door, her face alight with a new kind of excitement. Daddy, guess what?" she said, dropping her bag on the floor. "Everyone at school saw you on TV. They said you were famous." Lyndon braced himself. "Oh, did they?" "Yes. And Mrs. Davidson, my music teacher, she said our piano's broken and the school can't afford a new one, so they have to stop the music club." She took a deep breath, her eyes wide with the brilliance of her idea. But then Penny said, "Luna's dad is a piano hero. He can fix it. And everyone said you should come and play a concert for the school to raise money so we can get a new piano and save the music club." The words hit Lyndon with the force of a physical blow. He had closed the door on Aveline's world of contracts and fame. He had ignored the reporters and the whispers. But this was different. This was his daughter's world. This was her school, her friends, her music club. To refuse would be to disappoint her in a way he never had before. To agree would be to willingly step back onto a stage, an act that would be seen by the ravenous media as his official return, fueling the frenzy he was so desperate to escape. He looked at his daughter's hopeful, beaming face, her belief in him as absolute and uncomplicated as a ray of sunshine. "You can do that, right, Daddy?" she asked, her voice full of innocent certainty. "You can help?" Lyndon stood frozen in his small kitchen, trapped between the promise he'd made to his wife's memory and the hope shining in his daughter's eyes. The entire world was asking him to play. But for the first time, the request came in a voice he didn't know how to refuse. Lyndon looked at his daughter's face, a perfect, innocent vessel of hope, and felt his own carefully constructed world begin to crumble. 1,000 excuses died on his lips. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that the piano was a ghost? That music was a minefield of memories, that the roar of a crowd sounded like a scream he could never unhear. "Let me think about it, sweet pea," he managed to say, his voice strained. "It's a big decision." Luna, satisfied for the moment, nodded and went back to her homework. But the question remained, hanging in the air of their small apartment, a ticking clock he could not ignore. The next morning, the world gave him its answer. Julian's counterattack was swift and venomous. A story appeared on the front page of a notorious online tabloid, its headline screaming in bold, lurid letters. "The Maestro's Meltdown, Tragic Secret Behind Pianist's 5-Year Silence." The article, citing sources close to the original tragedy, painted a vicious, twisted picture. It spoke of Lyndon's artistic instability and erratic behavior leading up to the concert. It suggested his wife's death was a direct result of the stress from his public breakdown, and that his hand injury was a psychosomatic manifestation of his crippling guilt. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, designed to transform a returning hero into a fragile, pitiful recluse. Lyndon read it on his phone while waiting for the kettle to boil, and the sterile white screen seemed to radiate a sickening cold. The words were a physical violation, a desecration of Clara's memory, and the silent, dignified grief he had carried for 5 years. His first instinct was to shrink, to hide, to prove Julian's narrative right by disappearing. But then a different feeling began to smolder in the pit of his stomach, a cold, hard rage. His silence had been his shield, but he now saw that it had also been Julian's greatest weapon. At the Dubois Foundation, Aveline read the same article on her tablet, her lips tightening into a thin, angry line. An hour earlier, a private investigator she'd hired had delivered a file. In it was the official police report from the 5-year-old incident. She had read about the falling light rig, the tragic death of Clara Mitchell, and the inconclusive evidence of tampering with a support cable. She had also seen the primary witness statement, the one that guided the narrative away from foul play and toward a simple, tragic accident. The witness's name was Julian Blackwood. Seeing the tabloid piece, Aveline understood everything. This was not journalism. It was a hit piece. Julian was trying to poison the well, to destroy Lyndon's reputation before he could capitalize on it. The old Aveline would have seen this as a strategic problem, a complication in her asset acquisition. The new Aveline felt something else, a surge of protective fury. That afternoon, Lyndon's doorbell buzzed again. Assuming it was another reporter, he ignored it. But the buzzing was insistent. Finally, he looked through the peephole and was shocked to see Aveline Dubois standing in the hallway of his building alone. There was no limousine, no entourage. She was dressed in simple slacks and a blazer, and she looked completely out of place, a sleek panther in a city park. He hesitated, then opened the door. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hostile. "I'm not here to offer you a contract," she said quickly, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm here because of this." She held out her tablet, the tabloid article displayed on the screen. "And I know it's a lie." Lyndon stared at her, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. "Julian is a snake," she continued, her voice sharp with a newfound conviction, "and I don't like being played for a fool." She swiped the screen, bringing up a scanned document. "This is the initial police report from the accident. It mentions evidence of tampering, evidence that your friend Julian convinced them was irrelevant." He took the tablet from her, his dark hands trembling as he read the words he had never seen. The official language that gave weight to the dark suspicions he had harbored for years. It was validation. It was proof. He looked up at her, seeing her for the first time not as a corporate predator, but as an unlikely, powerful ally. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because Julian Blackwood made a fool of my foundation," she said. The answer a mixture of her old pride and a new, surprising integrity. "And because what he did to you and your wife is unforgivable. I tear down my competition, Mitchell. I don't bury them with lies." She followed him inside, and for the next hour, they talked. He didn't tell her everything, but he told her enough. He spoke of Julian's jealousy, of the small acts of sabotage that had plagued his final tour, of the gut feeling that the accident was no accident. He spoke of the silence, the fear, and the all-consuming need to protect Luna from that world. As he spoke, Aveline's eyes drifted to a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator door. It was the flyer for the school music program, decorated with Luna's hopeful crayon additions. "The world wants you to play for them," Aveline said quietly, connecting the pieces. "Your daughter wants you to play for her, and now Julian has given everyone a story that says you're too broken, too afraid to do it. His lies will become the truth unless you give them a new one." Lyndon looked at the tabloid article on the tablet, then at the school flyer on his fridge, his two worlds, pulling him in opposite directions. Aveline saw the conflict on his face and made her move. It was a new kind of offer, not a contract, but a strategy, an alliance. "Let the Dubois Foundation sponsor the school concert," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Forget Carnegie Hall. We'll do it in her school auditorium. We'll buy them a new piano, a Fazioli, the best in the world. We'll handle the press, we'll handle security. We will turn this small school fundraiser into a global broadcast. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. And in the middle of it, we will expose Julian Blackwood for the fraud that he is. All you have to do is play. Not for the world, not for me. She pointed a single manicured finger at Luna's drawing of him, the one with the piano and the crown of musical notes. You just have to play for her. Lyndon looked from the ugly lies on the tablet screen to the beautiful truth of his daughter's drawing. The choice was no longer about hiding from his past. It was about fighting for his future and for Luna's. Julian had written an ending to his story. Now Aveline was offering him the chance to write a new one. He looked at her, the formidable CEO who had become his unexpected champion, and the decision settled in his soul as clear and resonant as a final chord. Lyndon looked at the determined face of the woman he had, until yesterday, considered his adversary. He saw the calculated strategy in her eyes, but beneath it he saw something else, a spark of genuine integrity. She was offering him not a contract, but a sword. He took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel heavy with the weight of the past 5 years. Yes, he said. The single word was quiet, but it landed in the small apartment with the force of a tectonic shift. The moment the word was spoken, Aveline Dubois transformed. The empathetic ally became a 4-star general, mobilizing for war. Before she even left his apartment, she was on the phone. Her voice a rapid-fire succession of commands. Cancel my meeting with the board. Get me a full event planning team at the office in 1 hour. Yes, for a school fundraiser. Contact Fazioli directly. I don't care what it costs. I want their best concert grand delivered to Northwood Elementary by Friday. And get me Eleanor Vance from The Times on my private line. It's time we fed a real journalist a real story. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Aveline's corporate machine, a force typically used to swallow smaller companies and dominate markets, was now focused with laser precision on a small elementary school auditorium. On Friday, as promised, a massive truck arrived, and a team of specialists carefully unloaded a gleaming ebony Fazioli grand piano. The students watched from their classroom windows, their faces pressed against the glass in awe. When Luna saw it settled on the stage of her humble school auditorium, she looked as if she had just witnessed the arrival of a spaceship. The piano was a promise, a stunning, tangible symbol that Aveline was a woman who did not break her word. Lyndon began to practice in the evenings after the school had emptied out. The first few nights were a struggle. The Gala performance had been a burst of pure, untamed emotion, but now came the meticulous work of reclaiming his craft. His fingers, so accustomed to the grip of a mop handle, felt clumsy on the keys. The nerve damage in his left hand was a real, persistent ache, a ghost that whispered limitations with every difficult passage. But he pushed through, night after night, with Luna sitting in the front row, quietly drawing in her sketchbook, her silent presence a greater motivation than any sold-out concert hall had ever been. He was not just practicing scales, he was rebuilding himself one note at a time. The news of the concert, officially titled A Note of Hope, went public. Aveline's team had framed it perfectly. It was not a comeback tour, but a one-night-only benefit performance by a father for his daughter's school. They invited only the most respected music critics and journalists, turning down offers from the tabloid shows that were clamoring for access. Aveline also orchestrated a discreet leak. Key details from the police report, along with anonymous corroboration from a retired stagehand her investigators had found, were sent to Eleanor Vance. The narrative was being rewritten. Julian Blackwood saw the news and felt the ground crumble beneath him. The janitor he tried to crush had become a cause célèbre, championed by one of the most powerful women in the city. Desperation made him reckless. One evening, as Lyndon was leaving the school after practice, Julian was waiting for him in the shadows of the parking lot. "You think you can win, Mitchell?" Julian hissed, stepping in front of him. "You think a little school concert will erase the fact that you are a broken man who got his wife killed?" 5 years ago, those words would have shattered Lyndon. Now they landed like pebbles against a stone wall. Lyndon stopped and looked at his former rival, seeing him clearly for the first time, a small, pathetic man, terrified of his own mediocrity. "She died because of you, Julian," Lyndon said, his voice quiet and dangerously calm. "And you're right, I was broken. But you made one mistake." He stepped past him without another glance. "You forgot to account for my daughter." Julian was left alone in the darkness, choked by a rage that had lost its power. The night before the concert, Aveline came to the school. She found Lyndon sitting at the piano, not playing, just looking at the keys. "They're predicting the online live stream will have over 10 million viewers," she said, her voice soft in the empty auditorium. "I'm not playing for them," he replied, not looking up. "I know." She stood beside the piano, a rare moment of stillness for her. "My father built his company from nothing. He was ruthless. He taught me that you either conquer the world or get crushed by it. There was no in between." She paused. "Watching you, I'm beginning to think he might have been wrong." It was a confession, a glimpse behind the armor she had worn her entire life. He finally looked at her, and in that moment, they were not a CEO and a janitor, not a white billionaire and a black single dad, but two profoundly lonely people who had found in each other an unexpected and profound respect. The night of the concert arrived. The small school auditorium was unrecognizable, transformed by professional lighting and the quiet hum of broadcast cameras. The air was thick with an almost sacred anticipation. Backstage, in a classroom that had been turned into a makeshift dressing room, Lyndon stood in a simple black suit Aveline had insisted on providing. He felt the familiar pre-show jitters, but this time it was different. It wasn't the cold dread of the past, but the warm, electric hum of purpose. Luna came in wearing her favorite dress. She handed him a piece of paper. It was her drawing, the one of him, with the piano and the crown of musical notes. "For good luck, Daddy," she said, her smile so bright it could have lit up the room. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his breast pocket, directly over his heart. Aveline appeared at the door, her usual sharp business attire replaced by an elegant but understated dress. She looked at him, then at Luna, and a genuine, unforced smile touched her lips. She gave him a single, respectful nod. "The world is listening," she said. From the auditorium, he heard the principal of Northwood Elementary step up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, amplified and full of emotion. "Welcome to A Note of Hope. And now, performing for the first time in 5 years, please welcome Lyndon Mitchell." Lyndon took a deep breath, his hand instinctively touching the drawing in his pocket. He looked down at Luna, who squeezed his hand one last time. He then turned and walked towards the brilliant, waiting light. Lyndon stepped into the light. The applause that greeted him was not the shocked roar from the gala, but a warm, welcoming wave of sound. It was not for the maestro of midnight, the ghost of a legend. It was for Lyndon Mitchell, the father from apartment 2B. He walked to the Fazioli, the magnificent instrument his daughter now saw as a friend, and gave a simple, humble bow to the audience. He sat on the bench, but before his fingers touched the keys, he adjusted the small microphone placed near the piano. He had one more ghost to exercise. "Thank you for being here," he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying through the auditorium and across the globe to millions of listeners. "Before I begin, I want to dedicate this performance to two people." He paused, his gaze finding Luna in the wings. "To my daughter, Luna, who reminds me every day what courage looks like, and to the memory of my wife, Clara, who taught me how to love the music in the first place." The words were a direct refutation of Julian's lies, a reclamation of his own story. He was not a man haunted by guilt. He was a man motivated by love. He took a breath and placed his hands on the keys. But the music that followed was not the stormy, ferocious Rachmaninoff. It was a piece no one had ever heard before. It began with a simple, heartbreakingly beautiful melody, a theme that felt as intimate as a whispered secret. It was a lullaby filled with a gentle, aching tenderness. The music spoke of love and loss, of a sorrow so deep it became beautiful, and of a hope that refused to die. He was playing a piece he had composed in the quiet, lonely nights of the past 5 years. He called it Clara's Lullaby. As the melody filled the hall, it did more than just captivate the audience. It healed the man playing it. He was no longer battling his trauma. He was embracing it, transforming his pain into a work of art, a final beautiful gift to the wife he had lost. While the last notes of the lullaby hung in the air, a different kind of story was breaking. On the website of the New York Times, Eleanor Vance's article went live. The headline was stark: Maestro's tragedy or sabotage. Police report and new testimony suggest foul play in death of Clara Mitchell. The meticulously researched piece laid out the evidence of tampering, the inconsistencies in Julian Blackwood's witness statement, and the testimony of a retired stagehand who confirmed Julian had been near the lighting rig just before the accident. Backstage, phones began to buzz. Aveline, watching Lyndon from the wings, glanced at her own phone and saw the headline. A grim, satisfied smile touched her lips. Justice, like her business dealings, was a matter of precise, decisive action. Lyndon finished his performance with a final gentle chord that seemed to ask a question and answer it at the same time. For a moment there was silence, and then the applause began. It was not a roar this time, but a profound, emotional standing ovation, full of tears and a deep shared sense of catharsis. He took a bow, his eyes finding Luna. He walked off the stage and straight into her arms. The applause, for the first time, felt warm. It felt like acceptance. Aveline met him as he came off stage, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer congratulations or praise. Instead, she simply showed him the screen of her phone. He read the headline, then scanned the first few paragraphs. A weight he had been carrying for 5 years, a burden of unspoken suspicion and self-blame, finally lifted from his shoulders. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them, the ghost was gone. The fallout for Julian Blackwood was immediate and absolute. By morning, he had been fired from the Dubois Foundation, his name publicly disgraced. The district attorney's office announced they were officially reopening the investigation into the death of Clara Mitchell. His career was over. His lies were silenced. The villain had been punished not by a dramatic confrontation, but by the quiet, irrefutable weight of the truth. 6 months later, the Northwood Elementary Auditorium was filled with music once more. But this time it was the sound of children's voices and the sometimes clumsy notes of 30 aspiring young pianists. The Note of Hope concert had raised over $4 million, endowing the school's music program for a generation. At the center of the stage, Luna Mitchell was having her first piano lesson on the magnificent Fazioli, her small face a picture of pure joy. Lyndon Mitchell was not on a world tour. He had turned down every recording contract and performance offer. Instead, he had accepted a different position. He was now the first ever director of the Dubois Foundation's Youth Music Academy, the very charity the original Gala had been for. He worked out of a small office at Northwood Elementary, building a program to bring music to children all across the city. He was still home every night to make pancakes and tuck Luna into bed. He had found a way to share his gift not with the elite in concert halls, but with the children who needed it most. He had found the perfect harmony between his past and his present. Aveline Dubois often stopped by the school, no longer as a conqueror, but as a partner. She had found a new kind of bottom line, one measured not in dollars, but in the smiles of the children her foundation was now truly serving. She stood with Lyndon one afternoon, watching Luna patiently teach another child how to play a simple scale. "You could have had the world, you know," Aveline said quietly. Lyndon smiled, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "I do have the world," he replied. "She's right there." The story of the janitor virtuoso became a modern legend, a reminder that the world is full of hidden genius and that a person's worth is not measured by their title, but by the contents of their heart. Lyndon Mitchell had been offered fame and fortune, but he had chosen fatherhood and purpose instead. He learned that true strength was not in hiding from your deepest pain, but in facing it to build a better future for those you love. And Aveline Dubois, the woman who had everything, learned from the man who had lost so much that the greatest success is not in what you acquire, but in what you choose to give back. And in a quiet school auditorium filled with the hopeful, imperfect music of children, they both found a harmony that was richer and more rewarding than any standing ovation.
Thank you for staying with this story until the end. This story reminds us that the true greatness is often hidden in the quietest places. Titles can be taken away, status can disappear, but purpose, integrity, and love never do. When we choose courage over fear and stay true to who we are for the people we love, when the most broken silence can become something powerful and beautiful again.